Hi everyone, my name is Scott Gayfield and I am a medical student at the University of Toledo College of Medicine and Life Sciences. And in today's lesson, we are going to learn a little bit about skin. To start, we can ask, why do we even have skin? Well, skin serves as protection for our body. It's what helps prevent us from getting cut and helps prevent us from getting sunburns. And it also just holds everything together. We have everything in our body from blood and water and our heart, and our skin is kind of like a brick wall. It just kind of keeps it all in place. So to start, we'll take a look at what skin looks like. So on the top is the outside and on the bottom is the inside. So on top we have the epidermis or the outside dermis. Then in the middle of the green part we have the dermis. And then in the orange on the bottom we have what's called the hypodermis, which is underneath everything else. In the dermis and in the hypodermis, you see these red and blue lines. These are actually blood vessels. So the red lines are arteries and the blue lines are veins. And then right in the middle, you see this big black line kind of surrounded by pink. And that's actually a hair follicle. So that is just a piece of hair. It starts in the dermis and then comes out through the epidermis so that we can see it on the outside of our bodies. Now we're just going to take a second to kind of label what each of these layers of skin does. So starting with the epidermis, it is the most external, so it's the most outside of our bodies. So when we look at our skin, we are looking at the epidermis. And actually we'll get to see a picture of the epidermis later under a microscope. Next, we'll look at the green part in the middle, and this is called the dermis, like we said before. So this is the middle layer of the skin. It's in between the epidermis and the hypodermis. This is where blood vessels are, as we also said before, and we have labeled right there in the red and blue lines. So if we cut ourselves, that is because something penetrated our skin and went into the dermis and cut the blood vessels. So when we are bleeding, that's because we went through the epidermis and through the dermis as well to hit those blood vessels. And then also we have the hair follicle, which we can see sticking up right in the middle. So all the hairs we see in our bodies start on the dermis layer of the skin. And then finally we have sweat glands here. So when we go outside and we're really sweaty, all that sweat comes from the dermis layer of the skin. Finally, in the orange layer on the bottom, we have the hypodermis, which is underneath everything else. So this is the deepest layer of the skin. This is where fat is, and it's also where connective tissue is, which we talked about in the previous video about the cell. So this makes this layer very strong because connective tissue is really what is connecting everything and holding it all together. And then finally, as you see, similar to the dermis, we have these red and blue lines, so we also have blood vessels in the hypodermis, supplying our skin with the oxygen and nutrients that it needs. So one big topic that always comes up with skin is, how do we have our skin color? We know people of all different skin colors from pale to darker, so how does that happen? Well, there are so many skin colors, no one is the exact same, and that's what makes us really cool. And it all depends on melanin. So melanin is made inside of the cells, and now we're going to look at how that is done. Now we'll take a look at an old diagram that I made in my previous video about the cell. I'll put the link in the description below. And some cells in our body are really cool, and these different cells will have different organelles for whatever they are trying to do. So there are cells called melanocytes, and melanocytes have a special organelle called a melanosome. A melanosome kind of looks like a dark little star that I drew here, and these are actually what make melanin. So now I erased everything, and we're going to look at how these special cells actually make melanin. So first, the DNA in the nucleus, which is kind of like the brain of the cell, tells the cell what to do. So the DNA will send a message to the melanosome, the dark star, and it will tell it to please make melanin. And at that point, the melanosome will start to use some energy, and it will actually make melanin. And this melanin has a darker pigment to it, so it's a little bit darker than everything else, and that is why we have different skin colors, because different people will make different amounts of melanin. So if a melanosome is told to make a lot of different melanin, it will make the whole cell darker. So this is why some people may have darker skin, or maybe if you even have a freckle, that's because those cells make more melanin than everything else, so it gives it that darker brown pigment. So just to summarize what we just talked about, Different people make different amounts of melanin depending on what their DNA tells their cells what to do. So lighter skinned people, like on the left side of the screen, will have very little melanin. And as we go from left to right, these people have cells that make more and more melanin, which is why their skin color becomes a darker color. No one is the exact same, and skin color is a cool example of how we are all different in our own special ways. And as I just mentioned, freckles work the exact same way. So freckles are these small groups of cells that make more melanin. And that is why if you have freckles, you have these little circles of darker color. They are like these little teams of cells that group up and make more melanin together. And then in contrast, skin color is based on what all of the melanocytes or all of the melanin making cells in your body do. So that is why your skin color is more uniform, whereas freckles are these small little teams of cells that make these little circle dots. So something we have probably all had before is a sunburn, and I know I have had many. So we are going to take a look at a real picture of skin on the right side taken by a microscope and see how sunburns actually happen. So first, light will come in and then damage our skin because our epidermis is very weak, especially that white portion that I circled in blue. This will cause those cells to die, and when these cells die, they will peel away. So kind of like the guy on the left side, you might see peeling of your skin because the cells on the top of your skin died, and now they are peeling away so that they can be replaced by new, healthy, strong cells. Now, wearing sunscreen protects our skin and prevents the skin cells from dying, which is why it is so important to wear sunscreen when we go outside, especially when it is sunny. For the last topic of this lesson, we will talk about what happens when you hurt your skin. So, let's say you are playing basketball and you fall on the ground and scrape your knee. When you do this, you will probably hurt your epidermis and your dermis, but the hypodermis, the lower part, is probably still okay because it's really tough. Now, nothing really happens when you hurt the epidermis, which is why sunburns don't really hurt that much. But when you hit the dermis, you will hurt the blood vessels drawn in those red and blue lines, and that will cause blood to leak up through the dermis, up through the epidermis, and out of your skin, which is why you might see that you are bleeding and you might need to get a Band-Aid. Now, similar to a cut, we have bruises. So let's say you are playing basketball again, but now when you fall and hit your knee, you are not bleeding. That is because your epidermis, or the outside part that we see in blue, is actually okay. However, your dermis got hurt because of the force of the floor. As before, the blood vessels in the dermis will be hurt, but because the epidermis is okay, your blood will not leave the skin. This will cause a little pool of blood to form underneath your epidermis. And that is also why when you get a bruise, you will not need a Band-Aid, but you might see that it looks red or even purple underneath your skin. Well, that is all the content I have for today's lesson. As always, I have listed the sources where I got the pictures from. And finally, I just wanted to say thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I will see you next time.